Congressional election on legitimate rape, chronic Lyme disease, climate change denial, and teaching the controversy, the scientific awareness of our politicians is becoming increasingly important, while their ignorance becomes more and more painfully obvious. However, our nation was founded by free-thinking people of science. Where did we go wrong? How did we get here? So join me in welcoming Shawn Otto, author of Fool Me Twice, Fighting the Assault on Science in America, in tracing the route we took from our scientific roots to where we are now.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to start this over here because we're actually at the end of this program, so we're trying to get through our technical difficulties. Okay, so as Josh talked about, I talk a lot about science and democracy, particularly in the context not only of this book, but also of something called sciencedebate.org that I co-founded in 2007 to elevate conversation of science and technology issues in our democratic process. Whenever the people are well informed, Thomas Jefferson wrote, they can be trusted with their own government. And that idea informed much of his approach to the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States and how he conducted his presidency. It was essential, in fact, to a lot of the thinking of the founding fathers. But what happens now, 236 years later, in a world where science affects every aspect of life and is involved at the center of so many of our policy decisions, when things have become so complicated that no scientist can know everything that there is to know about science. This is causing what is called a science gap between the power of what we can do with knowledge and our ability to implement policy using the democratic form of government. Now, does anybody know what this picture represents? Those are Facebook connections around the globe. Now, you'll notice something very interesting coming up. As we get around to Asia, there's a part that gets dark. China, yeah, it's called the Great Firewall of China. And the reason that that's important is because we are increasingly tied together across the internet. Science is exploding at an enormous rate. Not only is there an increase in the number of scientists around the world, but there's a vast increase in the qualitative change in our ability to communicate with each other over the internet. The World Wide Web, in fact, was invented by particle physicists. So that interconnectivity is causing a phase change that many say will create more new knowledge in the next 40 years than we've created in the last 400 years since the beginning of the Enlightenment. So imagine some of the policy challenges that we're facing around science right now, the stuff that Rebecca was talking about with reproductive sciences, the stuff that we're dealing with climate change. In fact, science is creating a new dynamic that we have yet to find a way to solve. It is increasing the power of every individual enormously, as knowledge does create power. All of us have far more power. We've doubled our lifespans in the last 140 years. Average lifespan in the US has doubled in the last 140 years, thanks to science. So we've got vastly more power, vastly more time. We're having a similarly larger impact on our planet. And that is causing a lot of this conversation that we're seeing right now. So I'm going to give you an example. Consider the iPhone. Now, to many people, the iPhone is roughly equivalent to magic. They, in fact, both work magically. We don't quite know how they work. And they're both created by people who are cloistered away wearing long robes and speaking a strange language. Now, when you take the iPhone and you can't understand all the details of how it is engineered, and few people do, what happens? If you don't know what a microwave is, what happens? Well, in fact, it becomes, like many science issues today, a matter of belief. We're all very busy. We don't have time to read science. We don't have time to even study individual scientific papers outside of our discipline. So a lot of what we do is we trust in the scientific process and the peer review process. But that creates a hole. That creates a vulnerability where anti-science ideologues can find purchase to exercise some leverage. And I'm going to show you how that works. So in 2011, the World Health Organization issued a report. Headline said that your cell phone may cause brain cancer. Made headlines around the world. It's a very scary topic, and a lot of people have concern about that. But if you actually read the study, in a footnote, it noted that the statistical blip that they had found was indistinguishable from chance. So it is true that your cell phone may cause brain cancer. That is a scientifically valid statement. But the probability that that will happen is extraordinarily low, indistinguishable from random chance. So they got a statement and a headline out there, but it was not a scientifically valid outcome. Now consider, for instance, what microwaves do. Everybody's concerned about microwaves. They're radiation. Microwave radiation, we always hear. Radiation is bad, right? We all know that. Radiation can cause cancer, so therefore microwaves may be able to cause cancer. But if we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, the areas that cause cancer really are at the very low end of the ultraviolet range and the very high end of the visible light range. That's why we have to wear sunscreen. It can cause skin cancer. It's still not very strong, but that is the first time that light has enough power to break the bonds in a carbon atom, ionizing that carbon atom, knocking an electron out of the atom, and therefore disrupting DNA, damaging our DNA. That's how cancer is caused by radiation. Microwaves are far weaker than visible light, even than the infrared light that our bodies are all giving off right now. Everyone in this room is radiating about 500 watts of power in the infrared range right now as we sit here. Far more than your cell phone does. Microwaves are even weaker than that. In fact, microwaves are about 1/1,000,000th of the power necessary to ionize carbon, which is one of the most stable atoms. You have to know a lot about physics, chemistry, and biology in order to get that. So that's why the issue of belief comes into play. It becomes more and more difficult, the more and more complex our technology and our science becomes. So as a result of this difficulty, I'll give you an example of what happens in a policy way. Last year, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted 11-1, all Democrats, 10-1, all Democrats, to require every cell phone shop in San Francisco to warn you that your cell phone could give you brain cancer. Not supported by any science whatsoever. In fact, there's no epidemiological studies that have shown a link that is indistinguishable from chance. And basic high school physics shows why it's impossible. All you have to do is pull up the electromagnetic spectrum. You have to do a little bit of chemistry, reminding yourself of what you studied way back when. And yet they passed that. That's something that Rush Limbaugh probably back in the day would have complained about, and rightly so. Now let me show you an example from the other side of the political spectrum. This is called the Arctic open water extent. It's the inverse function of the Arctic sea ice extent. It's measured in September every year when sea ice is lowest. So we've seen over the last 30 years, this is a chart of the last 30 years, the increase. It doesn't include this year, which is off the charts, way above the highest figure we got in 2007. Now look how that matches up, very interestingly, with declared federal disasters by year. Of course, I'm talking about climate change here. Climate change is driving a vast increase in tax expenditures over declared federal disasters. Look how that overlays with global temperatures. This is the land-ocean index. And how that correlates with something called the Keeling curve, which is the measurement of the increase in atmospheric CO2. That's the data. And all these different data lines and dozens more all point in the same direction. So strongly that the National Academy of Sciences has now said that we should regard anthropogenic climate change as settled facts. Now let's look at another way that this impacts our pocketbook. Here is natural disasters tracked by a company called Munich Re. They are a reinsurer of U.S. property and casualty companies. And you'll see the green, blue, and orangey colored types of loss. Those are climatological, hydrological, meteorological. They all have to do with climate change. In the last 30 years, those forms of loss have quadrupled. The red at the bottom are the other forms of loss that are not related to climate. So this is vastly increasing our insurance losses, our insurance exposure, what we're paying for insurance premiums, what the government is paying to insure, what the government is spending on federal disasters. So you'd think that this would be a major policy discussion because of the finances. And yet, 94 of 100 new GOP lawmakers elected in 2010 deny that it is happening, or have pledged to oppose any mitigation efforts. So I want to give a short sampling of statements from some of them. Oh, shit. No, we don't have. Once in a while this happens with John Showcas's video. So I'm going to tell you what John is saying there. He's talking about, he's referencing that book in his hand. You'll see that. That's a scientific paper there, his Bible. He's conducting a hearing on climate change and on climate science, and he says the world will not end in a flood. God says man will not destroy the earth. In fact, that there is a serious theological debate that we may be living in a carbon-starved planet. Serious theological debate. I don't know about you, but I don't remember reading anything about carbon in the Bible. Maybe I missed it. But the point is that this man chairing this committee is relying on received wisdom instead of data. Received wisdom from an interpretation of an old book several thousand years old. And he's using that as a means to make policy for everyone in the country. Now consider what the second most powerful man in the government who controls the flow of legislation through Congress has to say about it.
So what is the responsibility? That's my question. What is the Republican plan to deal with carbon emissions, which every major scientific organization has said is contributing to climate change?
George, the idea that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen that's harmful to our environment is almost comical. Every time we exhale carbon dioxide. Every cow in the world, when they do what they do, you've got more carbon dioxide.
So it's hard to know where to begin with this, right? He's on national TV, so he doesn't want to make a fool of himself. He's being earnest. He's trying to answer the question, and yet he thinks that scientists say that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen. I don't know of any climate scientists that have said that. Again, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe they're reading different data than I am. Or that cows fart carbon dioxide. I haven't heard that from either. But if he is in control of the flow of legislation through the House, it makes it difficult to understand how we could have a serious discussion of this if this is the level of his knowledge of the data in one of the most important policy discussions we are facing in the country, no matter which side that you're on. So the question is are the people still well enough informed to be trusted with their own government? Judging from Congress, the answer is probably not. In fact, of the 535 members of Congress, how many do you suppose have a professional background in science? Two? You're actually close. The answer is 9. Less than 2%, and that's counting engineers. Some scientists feel that they're not quite scientists, but I disagree. One physicist, one chemist, 6 engineers, and a microbiologist. How many do you suppose are lawyers? 222. And they did mostly duck science class in college. We'll take questions at the end if you don't mind. Pardon? Not physicians I don't count as scientists, because many of them do not practice science-based medicine, in fact. And many of them actually are very poor in using evidence and making decisions. So, no, I'm talking hard sciences. Lawyers actually do often tend to abduct science classes in college. Many of them, their last science class was in high school. There are some attorneys that do patent law, do IP law, and that do litigation relative to different corporations that they work for that are very, very versed in it. But generally, this is an issue when it comes to people running for Congress. So it's no wonder that we see more rhetoric-based argumentation up there than we see knowledge-based argumentation. A lawyer is often trained, and the attorneys in the audience will hopefully attest to this. Sorry, just going to get untangled here. To present the evidence that helps prove up the case, then you rely on the opposing counsel to present the evidence that supports their side. You're not going to go present that evidence too. Your job is not to be the judge, to present both sides and to assess data and to arrive at the answer. Your job is to make the strongest argument for your client that you can. And then you rely on the judge, or the jury, or the body of Congress as a whole to assess both arguments and see which is the most compelling. The problem is that when we have an information input from science in a big policy issue, that doesn't work. Because we're not making a decision based on rhetoric. We need to be making it based on knowledge. Okay, so there's two key concepts that I often talk about. Science is never partisan. But science is always political. And those of you in this room are probably really familiar with this. And here's why. Science is both left in that it's progressive. The scientists will always be willing to move forward, to embrace new ideas, because that's where the exciting frontiers of discovery are. But a scientist is also conservative. They're not going to stick their neck out there and without fully embracing all of the tradition that has come before. You want to read through anything and everything that's been published on this topic so you don't embarrass yourself, so you don't make a claim that's already been refuted somehow in the literature. That's a quick way to damage your career. So science doesn't really have anything to say in the left-right divide going on in the country. Science is about knowledge, about reality. But science is always political. And it's political because it doesn't take anything on faith. It says, show me the evidence and I'll make my own decision. That places science firmly at the top, at the anti-authoritarian political divide. You can have authoritarians that are on the left, Maoist China, on the right, Nazi Germany, that generally, ultimately, wind up being opposed to science. But anti-authoritarians generally are about individual liberties, and they find very much common cause with scientists and science. The reason that it's always political is that new knowledge either confirms or challenges vested interests and old beliefs. Be they ideological or economic, and I'll give a couple examples. Galileo and the Catholic Church in 1633. At the time, the Catholic Church was the seat of world economic and political power when they indicted Galileo for daring to say that Copernicus was right. Nowadays, climate scientists in the U.S. energy industry. The U.S. energy industry is similarly the seat of world economic and political power right now. The wealthiest public company in the world is alternatively Apple Computer or ExxonMobil. Privately, the second wealthiest private company is Koch Industries. Wealthiest is Cargo, so food and energy. So it's arguable that with a couple of $1 trillion of carbon left in the ground, it's worth a couple of $1 billion to throw at climate denial to protect that investment, and it's arguable that they are exercising that power in a similar way to the Catholic Church. So, grappling with these issues when we founded the country, Jefferson was really concerned with how do we know things? How is it that we know things? And this was really an important conversation for him to get to the Because just imagine, you're sitting there in those 2 rented rooms in Philadelphia, it's hot, it's sweltering, you're writing in your desk, and you've been assigned this task of coming up with a declaration that is going to keep other countries at bay, that's going to make an argument that is so compelling that no other country is going to interfere in this argument that you're having with England. How do you convince them? Well, if you make an argument that that God is on our side, you're not going to get anywhere, because you're just going to enter into a religious debate with another country who says, no, we have the true access to God. So how do you make an argument that is more compelling, that protects you? Their lives are really hanging in the balance. So Jefferson turned to his trinity of 3 greatest men, he called them. Jefferson was not only a lawyer, but like Bacon, he was also a scientist. His trinity were Isaac Newton, the creator of physics, Francis Bacon, the creator of inductive reasoning, and John Locke, the creator of empiricism. He, like many other founding fathers, turned to the ideas of science to found the United States of America and to make that argument. But let's back up for a minute before we really look at what he did and ask, where does this come from? How do we really know things? What's the difference between knowledge and belief? Well, in 1517, a guy that many of you know about, named Martin Luther, posted those 95 Theses on the church door, arguing that the Catholic Church had become corrupt in its authoritarian ways by asking for indulgences. People would pay the church, and then the Pope, who Luther said was richer than the richest Crassus, was using those contributions from poor people to buy their way into heaven to build a new St. Mark's Cathedral. He thought that this was terrible. He charged them with corruption, and he used the printing press he translated the Bible into German from Greek and Latin, and he used a printing press to print his Luther Bible. Huge bestseller throughout Europe, 100,000 copies, which was enormous in the day. Enormous. Bigger than Harry Potter in the day. And what that did was he said, wait a minute, don't listen to the intercessionaries in the Catholic Church. Read it for yourself. Decide for yourself what it says. This was the birth of formal anti-authoritarianism. It split the authoritarian and the anti-authoritarian strains of thought in Western thinking from that point forward. Now, I know that Rebecca talked about the Puritans, but in fact, the Puritans grew out of this anti-authoritarian Lutheran strain of thinking. In fact, in 1672, in 1672, the percentage of the membership of the Royal Academy of Sciences in London, which was the premier place that science was being done in the world, was 62% Puritan. Puritans were the free thinkers. And Puritans were free thinkers because they believed in 2 things. There were 2 books. There was the book of Revelation, which was the Bible, and then there was the book of nature. And by studying nature, you could discern God's will. And Puritans really liked the idea of studying nature because that was a more direct way of apprehending God's will. This they called natural philosophy, which in turn turned into science. So these are the roots of Western science. They lie in natural philosophy and the idea that the Puritans had that you could study the book of nature to discern God's will. So, taking these ideas forward, John Locke wrote something called an essay concerning human understanding. You can look it up online. There's a couple of copies that are really remarkable, and I'd encourage you to read them. Because this is in many ways the founding document that Jefferson relied on in creating the United States. And in fact, this created the idea of empiricism. Locke noticed how all these different factions of Lutheranism, Protestantism, were arguing with each other. I have the true path to God. No, I have the true path to God. And he thought there must be some way of knowing what is true. Who really was talking about knowledge and who was just making a claim that was based on belief or opinion. So he came up with a means of defining what knowledge is, and it was subject to tests that grounded in reality. The first and most powerful form of knowledge is what he called intuitive. 1 plus 1 is 2, or black is not white. That's obvious, right? The next is demonstrative. That's taking intuitive pieces of knowledge and putting them together to come to a conclusion that you can demonstrate. A feather falls more slowly in air than a penny does. When we remove the air with a vacuum pump, the penny and the feather fall at the same time. Therefore, air must have density. And gravity works the same on all objects. Finally, let's see, there we go, sensitive. Sometimes, he said, this is the weakest form of knowledge because it can sometimes, our senses can sometimes confuse us. Sometimes we smell a rose, but it's really just someone's perfume. So those types of arguments really based on senses are the most confusing to us. So common sense, in fact, is the most confusing. And that's what we've really learned through science. So when you hear politicians talking about common sense, they're celebrating the most confusing and deceitful form of knowledge. So Locke said, whatever comes short of one of these, with whatever assurance so embraced, is but faith or opinion, but not knowledge, at least in all general truths. So sitting there in that hot little room, Jefferson began writing, and this is a copy of one of his early drafts of the Declaration of Independence. And there's something very interesting in this draft that I want to draw your attention to. It shows the confusion and the difficulty that the best meaning people have separating out beliefs and opinions from knowledge. This first draft, right here, says, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." That was his first language, that all men are created equal. He handed over to Ben Franklin to give a first read-through and make some suggestions. And Franklin, you see several backslashes. Franklin was the world's most famous scientist at the time. He crossed that out and said, "Tom, you don't want to do that, because then you're creating that same argument that we're trying to get away from, that makes us vulnerable. If we don't stick together, we'll surely all hang separately," right? No, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Self-evident was an idea that John Locke initiated by saying that you have to bring the mind to the place at which it bottoms. And that's what Jefferson was seeking to do by creating that argument that would be impossible to deny. It was carried forward by David Hume, who was a friend of Thomas, or Benjamin Franklin. So that's how, really, in that correction right there, it can be argued, was the separation of church and state that came forward in all the thinking. And in fact, when we hear about democracy today, for instance, the Arab Spring, that's the piece that's missing. Just being able to vote doesn't do anything unless you are able to vote in a secular way that is separate from belief. Because the idea of democracy is to base public policy decisions on evidence, not on faith of the majority. So let's look at the difference between these two. Scientific method and the creationist method. Here are the facts. What conclusions can we draw from them, says the scientist. Here's the conclusion. What facts can we find to support it, says the creationist. This is a good example of the social challenge that science is constantly presenting us with. When we refine our knowledge about reality, it challenges us to refine our values, and that's always uncomfortable. But both must evolve together. And the gap that we're seeing right now is because our knowledge is leaping ahead of our value structure. This is particularly a problem for literalist religions who rely on old explanations, and they're challenged by new knowledge. So one reason that I like to talk to atheist groups is that I say they must be a part of this value discussion. Must is very important that everybody in this room engage in some ways besides coming to conventions here. That they engage in the general national public dialogue in this value discussion. Because the other side certainly is. Now let's take a look. If we're going to be talking about engaging, we have to understand how this is happening. So I want to explore some of the broader issues at stake here and what has been going on with the idea of science and evidence in the U.S. political dialogue over the last 100 years or so. In the early part of the last century, science was immediately commercialized. We're extremely proud of our ability to take new ideas and to create assembly lines or internal combustion engines. Science created vast wealth, vast national pride, vast opportunity. But as it advanced, it became an intellectual weapon, a means of winning the war for democracy. And it indeed did, but our value decision to drop bombs on civilians, killing hundreds of thousands of them, caused a great discussion in this country, a terrific reflection on this question of whether our values were not keeping up with the power of our knowledge. And we began to doubt science. The general public began to doubt science. Then, of course, Sputnik in 1957, not only had the Russians exploded a nuclear weapon of their own in 1949, but now, theoretically, they could put it in space and perhaps drop it down on us. So science became the source of fear, and the science race, the space race, was born. So science, for the first time, became a national priority like never before, in peacetime, as it had been made during World War II. Kids were, brought into the cafeterias to watch moon launches, cars wheeled in on TVs. Everybody was interested in science. But this led to the creation of the NSF, the full funding of the NSF. And part of that creation didn't require scientists to do any public engagement. So scientists who before had to win over the public, people like Edwin Hubble, who spoke to standing room only crowds of 5,000 people talking about astronomy, suddenly didn't need to win them over or win wealthy benefactors over anymore. They needed to convince each other in review boards and panels that this was important in order to get funding. This did very appropriately explode the U.S. science enterprise. It propelled the United States, as Vannevar Bush thought that it would, into a leading position. But what it did is it removed scientists from the national dialogue at a time when religion, because of the atomic bomb and other issues, was organizing heavily, and industry was organizing heavily. So we wound up with a disproportionate representation in our national dialogue. Then, with Silent Spring, the publication 50 years ago, about last week, Rachel Carson, for the first time, suggested that science was perhaps polluting our environment in terrible ways. That kids who had played in the fog clouds of DDT in the 50s and early 60s had been playing in clouds of poison. That there were many other chemicals that we had quickly commercialized and were dumping into the environment that were destroying our environment. And then moved from that worry to discomfort over advances in the biological sciences, many of which Rebecca was talking about. At the time, there were debates whether or not test tube babies, as they called in vitro fertilization back then, whether or not they would have souls. Turns out that it appears that they do. We haven't finished testing it, but it seems like it. So let's take this into the broader line of what's happening today. Those last 2 points split the United States culturally over science. Our advances in environmental science and the birth of environmental science leading to or suggesting new regulations that opposed industry commercialization, and our advances in biological sciences that offended fundamentalist evangelical religions. So we wind up with something that reflects our current party structure in some unusual ways. Old industry and old religion on one side, science and environmentalists on the other. The idea on the right is that science represents creeping socialism. Generally because science is always about looking at this relationship between the individual and the environment, because it increases our power over the environment. It creates certain issues. And their anti-science tends to be around climate change, evolution, reproduction, industry, and old religion. On the left, science is more about hidden dangers, and the anti-science theme is hidden dangers. Their anti-science is generally going to be suspicion against mainstream medicine, the idea that cell phones can cause brain cancer, the idea that vaccines may cause autism, or that there's EMF pollution from electromagnetic waves, or that fluoride in your water may be there to control your thinking, or that GMO crops are somehow unhealthy. The motivation on the right is, of course, anti-regulation, anti-reproductive control, and pro-corporate. And on the other side is pro-environment, pro-choice, and anti-corporate. So it's important to realize the ways that this is played out in our culture. The theme that you will often hear then is that liberal scientists with a socialist agenda want to control your life and limit your freedom. That's what people like Rush Limbaugh say. On the other side, it's impersonal doctors, greedy corporations, and mechanistic scientists hide the real dangers to health, the environment, and our spirit. So we need to be aware of both sides, and remember that critical thinking isn't the issue. It's evidence-based thinking that's important. I'll get into that in a minute. The other thing is that all of this division that's happened since early 1970s has largely happened without any input from scientists in the national dialogue. They've been largely quiet until fairly recently. And so this is a lot of people going on talking on about nothing that they really know much about. So we need to realize that we are having a civil Cold War over science. And it's not just me that's saying this. I'm quoting James Dobson in the late 1980s, who said the 1990s would be the Civil War decade. We're going to have a civil war over values. I'm quoting people like Christopher Monckton, who says, now we're in an era of a new civil war. And the greatest part of that civil war is the global warming battle. So this is language that is being used by the anti-science types over and over again. They view this as a civil war. And I think that people who value reason, secularism in our decision-making need to recognize that and realize that that's what they're engaged in. So I want to give some examples of how this is playing out and the pressures that this is playing out in this last presidential race.
There's a woman who came up crying to me tonight after the debate. She said her daughter was given that vaccine. She told me her daughter suffered mental retardation as a result of that vaccine. There are very dangerous consequences. It's not good enough to take, quote, a mulligan where you want a do-over, not when you have little children's lives at risk.
Man-made global warming is poppycock. I hope I can say that on your show.
You know you can.
In other words, I don't believe in it. Look, if people look at the real data, the climate has varied ever since we have known that the planet was here. And we know that those scientists who tried to concoct the science to say that we had a hockey stick global warming and they were busted because they manipulated the data. No. Man-made global warming is not a crisis.
Now, Michelle Bachmann is her own special case, but Herman Cain actually is, and has been up until he ran for president, was quite respected in business circles. So the fact that he felt the need to make these ridiculous comments and others that he said shows you the tremendous pressure that people are under to knuckle under to make it through the nominating process in a party that has become dominated by fundamentalist anti-science evangelicals.
For evolution to explain the creation of the human species from nothing to human beings, absolutely not. I don't believe in that.
HPV, forcing 12-year-old girls to take an inoculation to prevent this sexually transmitted disease. This is not good medicine. I do not believe. I think it's social misfit.
But I'm opposed to getting involved in the process of killing children in order to have research materials. And I think you're finding, if you look at what's happening with stem cell research, we have less and less demand that you have anything except regular stem cells because we're learning how to use them.
Now, Newt's an interesting case, too. Newt is actually a supporter of science debate. He's emailed me when he first signed up and said, I'll do anything I can to support science. And when he was speaker, he had a checkered record with it. He cut the funding for the Office of Technology Assessment, which was Congress's science advisory body, but he sought to double the funds of the NIH. So for him to make this statement was quite surprising to me. But when he made it was interesting. It was when he was really down in the polls, and after making this flamboyantly anti-science statement that stem cell research is killing children to get research material, he went up in the polls. In fact, most of these candidates would trot out ridiculous anti-science statements when they were saying and they'd go back up.
You yourself have said the party is in danger of becoming anti-science. Who on the stage is anti-science? Listen, when you make comments that fly in the face of what 98 out of 100 climate scientists have said, when you call into question the science of evolution, all I am saying is that in order for the Republican Party to win, we can't run from science. Governor Huntsman was not specific about names, but the two of you do have a difference of opinion about climate change. Just recently in New Hampshire, you said that weekly or even daily, scientists are coming forward to question the idea that human activity is behind climate change. Which scientists have you found most credible on this subject?
Well, I do agree that the science is not settled on this. The idea that we would put Americans' economy at jeopardy based on scientific theory that's not settled yet, to me is nonsense. I mean, and I tell somebody, I said, just because you have a group of scientists that have stood up and said, here is the fact, Galileo got outvoted for a spell.
Right, by people like him.
I don't speak for the scientific community, of course, but I believe the world's getting warmer. I can't prove that, but I believe, based on what I read, that the world is getting warmer. And number two, I believe that humans contribute to that.
Now, the interesting thing about this is the day, or a couple days after Governor Romney declared his candidacy for the presidency. This was the first town hall forum that he held after that announcement, and this was the first question. It was about climate change. Now, after he made that statement, 4 days later, Rush Limbaugh went on his radio show, national radio show, and blasted him, and here's what Rush said.
Bye-bye nomination. Bye-bye nomination. Another one down. We're in the midst here of discovering that this is all a hoax. The last year has established that the whole premise of man-made global warming is a hoax.
Now, there's a lot of interesting things that you could conclude from this statement, too. First of all, even if there were legitimate debate about whether or not it's a hoax, why would that be so charged that Rush would say bye-bye nomination just for uttering it? Just for uttering the idea, bye-bye nomination. It's because ideology is so fired up in this discussion that contrary views in actual discussion are forbidden. So, wanting the nomination, Governor Romney adjusted his rhetoric, and by October of last year, this is what he was saying.
My view is that we don't know what's causing climate change on this planet, and the idea of spending trillions and trillions of dollars to try and reduce CO2 emissions is not the right course for us.
Okay, so there you have it. The investors backing much of this discussion are being pleased here. He went on in the same discussion to advocate strongly for more drilling and laxer regulations. So I know that we've talked about Todd Akin a little bit here already, but this is another example, more local, about the Cold Civil War that we're having.
If an abortion could be considered in a case of, say, a tubal pregnancy or something like that, what about in the case of rape? Should it be legal or not?
Well, you know, people always want to try and make that as one of those things. Well, how do you slice this particularly tough sort of ethical question? It seems to me, first of all, from what I understand from doctors, that's really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
Now, the interesting thing about this is when you do have a tough ethical question, it's a public policy question, you should reach out and find any evidence, right? And that's actually what he suggests. He says that he's talked to doctors, and what he understands from doctors, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down. He sits on the House Science Committee, which is why this was troubling to me, and I wrote about it at the time. In fact, there is no scientific evidence that the female body has some mechanism to shut that whole thing down. But in fact, what science there is shows that it's not extremely rare. Women who are raped are, in fact, up to 2 times as likely to become pregnant. We're not quite sure why that is. It may have something to do with victim selection. We just don't know. But we do know that statistically that appears to be true. But since Aiken sits on the House Science Committee, he should have access to this. Instead, it appears that he is going to a propaganda website called Physicians for Life, which supplies him with this false data. Here's another more recent example. This is just from last week.
But God's Word is true. I've come to understand that. All that stuff I was taught about evolution and embryology and Big Bang Theory, all that is lies straight from the pit of hell. And it's lies to try to keep me and all the folks who are taught that from understanding that they need a Savior. You see, there are a lot of scientific data that I've found out as a scientist that actually show that this is really a young Earth. I don't believe that the Earth is but about 9,000 years old. I believe it was created in 6 days as we know them. That's what the Bible says. And what I've come to learn is that it's the manufacturer's handbook is what I call it. It teaches us how to run our lives individually, how to run our families, how to run our churches. But it teaches us how to run all of public policy and everything in society. And that's the reason as your congressman, I hold the Holy Bible as being the major directions to me of how I vote in Washington, D.C., and I will continue to do that.
So the problem with this is that these people not only believe that they're in a civil war, but they are organized. They're building up backup financial institutions, media structures, a whole shadow economy to support an evangelical takeover of the United States government and their mounting candidates who believe this stuff. He is also on the House Science Committee, which controls the budget of the National Science Foundation and much of the United States investment in science. So we need people like you in this room to do the same thing, to get out there, to be organized, to donate to candidates who are, to take on people like him, not only by voting, but by standing up and speaking out in the public forum, by writing letters to the editor, by getting involved in other ways, by perhaps even joining the Republican Party and being one of the few who turns the gatekeeper control the other way and pushes some of those people out, because there's very few activists that actually control that process that determines the public dialogue of the entire nation. And they right now have controlled that or taken that over. So here's an example of why people on that side feel so strongly about it. This is one of Ken Ham's cartoons. If you were brought up believing this and being indoctrinated with this thinking, you can imagine how difficult it is. On the right, we see the island of creation, and it's being attacked by the island of evolution, which of course everyone knows is associated with Satan. Now, the priests are doing some interesting things. The idea of this comic was to exhort people who are religious to become more far right. Don't do silly things like aim your cannon at each other or shoot off in the wrong direction. Shoot like this guy is doing at the foundation. Here we have a priest shooting up and popping one of the symptoms of evolution, and we all know the symptoms of evolution, right? Abortion, racism, homosexuality, divorce, right? That's what evolution causes. So, if you believe this, you need to move further to the right and oppose science. Now, you think that it's perhaps just Republicans. No, it's not. Consider this conversation that happened recently in Congress.
From my perspective, just as an old country boy, and that's the only way I can understand this complex stuff. We need parallels in the virtual world to what we have in the real world. And I think this bill draws the appropriate balance
I'm not a nerd.
I am not a nerd. It's not just not enough of a nerd.
Maybe we ought to ask some nerds what this thing really does. Let's have a hearing. Bring in the nerds.
So these people are running away from being nerds because they think that that's somehow politically unpopular. Why? Because the bullies are running the school right now, right? We need more nerds to get involved. The thing is, in any science, as I've tried to show you, can become politicized because for many people, science has become a matter of belief, which is why we need much more communication about the tools of thinking out there in our public dialogue. And I'll give you an example. Rush Limbaugh talks about this as a worldwide hoax, talking about climate change. His primary target is you, the people of the United States. Senator Inhofe, the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Similar thing happened, interestingly enough, in the early 1920s in Weimar, Germany. Right-wing relativity deniers attacked Einstein's theory of relativity as Jewish science and a big hoax. Einstein said this world is a strange madhouse. Currently, every coachman and every waiter is debating whether relativity theory is correct. Belief in this matter depends on political party affiliation. Sound familiar? Is the public stupid? Are they just uneducated? Turns out no. In a 2001 NSF science survey, 53% of American adults were unaware that the last dinosaur died before the first human rose, probably because they saw them together in the Flintstones. 50% of adults knew that the Earth orbits the sun and takes a year to do it. 53% knew that human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals. Now this is all interesting and it suggests the public is stupid, but listen, in 2007, nearly 60% of U.S. adults surveyed stated their belief that God created humans in their present form less than 10,000 years ago. So we go from 47%, the inverse of the 53% of the top statement, to 60%, 13% bump in 6 years. Why? What happened? Well, we had 6 years of control of the White House by President Bush and of both houses of Congress by Republicans. And during that time, Karl Rove, an atheist, walked through the White House whistling "Onward Christian Soldiers" because they were anxious to remotivate evangelicals who Bush had lost. About 18 million of them had stayed home. So they began a concerted strategy of campaigning in churches. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, people. You guys can do the same thing that Karl Rove did. You just have to invest in it. It would be worthy of the effort of a lifetime. So is religion dumbing down Americans? No. In 2004, there was a very interesting study. They rephrased the question. They said, according to scientists, humans, as we know them today, evolved from earlier species of animals. And then how many got it right? 72%. Whopping difference. In line with other countries. So the idea isn't that people are stupid. People hold conflicting sets of belief about this. They know what scientists say, but they also know what their pastor says. So it gets into the idea of the knowledge frame versus the faith frame. Now, here's one more example of this. Amongst the Republicans, college-educated versus non-college graduates, belief in climate change actually goes down with education. So increasing level of education does not change this. What it does is it causes people to feel entitled to be more skeptical of authority. Among Democrats, something similar happens. Liberal, educated whole food shoppers are more likely to be vaccine refusers. So why is this? Critical thinking isn't enough. And we've fallen down to this in our education system. We all talk about critical thinking and celebrate critical thinking, but it's evidence-based critical thinking. We need to reconnect with the evidence portion of it that is so important. That's the idea of empiricism. That's the idea of democracy. So maybe the media will help us, and I know that I'm going to run, wherever your timekeeper is, I'm going to run a couple minutes over because we got started a couple minutes late. Well, we decided to explore that question in 2007, 2008. And in fact, the League of Conservation Voters did a similar thing, and they found that of the 5 top TV news anchors, They conducted at that point in time 171 interviews asking the candidates for president almost 3,000 questions. How many do you suppose were about climate change or global warming, which is arguably the biggest policy topic that they had to discuss? Any ideas? Yeah, six. To put that in perspective, 3 were about UFOs. So there's probably some confirmation bias going on here too. A lot in the media ran away from science in college. Very few of them actually took science classes. That's why they went into the humanities, to get away from that hard stuff. But what this does is it causes something called false balance. Journalism, there's always 2 sides to every story we hear. 2 + 2 = 4, says Bob. Julie says it's 6. The controversy rages. We've got a good story going on, right? Science, though, says most times one side is simply wrong. We can find evidence. Using this evidence, I can show you that Bob is clearly right. Then there's politics. How about a compromise? We pass a new law. 2 + 2 is 5. And that's our politics in the United States in a nutshell right there. But the problem is that false balance in journalism always weights the argument towards extremes and authoritarianism. Because you place somebody that's making an evidence-based argument against somebody who's just voicing their opinion. And it elevates the authority of the opinion to being on par with knowledge. And as John Locke showed in 1689, that's not doable. That leads to endless warring opinions. That leads to the gridlock that we're seeing in Congress right now. The media is a big part of that. It has vast consequences for the nation. David Gregory was asked when he was the NBC White House chief correspondent, how come none of you guys in the White House press corps pressed President Bush hard about the lack of any evidence for weapons of mass destruction before going into Iraq and committing the nation to what turned out to be perhaps $1 trillion in expenditures, thousands of lost lives, perhaps 100,000 lost Iraqi lives. And he says, I respectfully disagree. It's not our role. Well, if it's not the role of the press to dig down and find the objective story, whose role is it? And how will democracy continue to work? It's a very important question, and the press needs to be held accountable on this. And everybody in this room can write letters to the editor, educating them about that, and holding them accountable. Knowledge-based arguments are important, and they're different from opinions. But I'll show you how endemic this is in the press. Here's new reporter guidelines from the Voice of San Diego, an otherwise great online newspaper. But there it is, right in their reporter guidelines. There is no such thing as objectivity. If you believe that, you're not going to dig to get at the real story. You're going to go to some wacko with an opinion on one side, like Todd Akin, and then you're going to pair them up with a scientist on the other. And it doesn't matter that that scientist represents 1 million other scientists and the wacko represents 3 other people. You're going to present them as equal, and then you have a story. But that's a great disservice to democracy. Here's Linda Ellerbee. There she says again, and this is a leading Washington, D.C. News anchor. We report the news, not truth. There is no such thing as objectivity. These people believe this. Here, of all people, the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, the chief libertarian publication, says it again. There's no such thing as objectivity. It's an epidemic in thinking throughout journalism schools. It's being taught throughout journalism schools. It's a big problem for a country whose public policy decision-making apparatus was based on the idea that there is evidence. So here's why. We have something that Jefferson thought of as the virtuous circle of democracy. We have governance issue, some problem that we need to talk about in government, climate change, or birth control, or abortion. It's contentious. We need to figure out what we're going to do, what our national policy is. Well, being democracy, we turn to the educated, informed mass of the people. That's a quote from Jefferson. That he had great faith in, that they would always do the right thing if they were well informed. And that was our best protection against tyranny. Well, those people then would do scientific research, like Jefferson did when he sent Lewis and Clark out on their expedition. It was a scientific expedition, he told them, to build knowledge so we could make good decisions. And based on that knowledge, we would debate the best public policy for the country. That's the way it was supposed to work. But what's been happening lately is something very different. Vested interests found a leverage point. If you can get in and you can provide alternative theories to our children in our public schools, and you can provide propaganda to adults, you can move the educated and informed mass of people out of the circle of democracy. Then what happens? Everything else flows from there. Instead of turning to scientific research and knowledge, we turn to authority and ideology for knowledge, like Representative Shimkus was, like Representative Brome was. Then, instead of debating the best public policy based on knowledge, we debate it based on dogma. Instead of knowledge, we go to dogma. We're moving away from knowledge and back into the belief or opinion that the whole idea of the country's founding was to get away from, was that tyranny of a ruler who claimed to have proximity to God. What does that lead to? It changes democracy into authoritarianism. That's what that's a recipe for. That's the civil war that we're fighting right now in this country. That's the civil war that they have declared. They want to substitute their view of God in an authoritarian way and apply public policy to everyone. So what can we do? Well, we formed, a small group of 6 individuals formed something called Science Debate 2008. We put up a website, and within a few weeks, we had 39,000 scientists, engineers, and concerned citizens sign on. And I would encourage everybody in this room to go to sciencedebate.org and sign on, and tell your friends to. We formed partnerships with the National Academies, the AAAS, the Council on Competitiveness. They were our chief endorsers. 100 leading U.S. universities signed on, several Nobel laureates, even members of Congress, even CEOs of companies like Intel and Texas Instruments. And we were calling for the candidates for president to start debating these big science topics. After all, they debate economics, even though none of them were economists. They debate faith and values, even though none of them were pastors or priests. They debate foreign policy and military, even though neither of them were generals or diplomats. So why not the big science issues that are facing the country that we're stuck on, and that we've been stuck on, that are growing worse and worse, but yet are affecting every voter's lives? What would happen? Well, they wouldn't do it. At the time, McCain ignored us, and Clinton and Obama instead turned us down and went to the Compassion Forum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where on CNN they debated faith and values. What does that tell you? It tells you the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And that people in this room and rooms like it need to organize into a political bloc. The only way that those people wound up debating those issues is because faith and values community, the far right, was organized and moving the debate. So the result of just a few people trying to do good, we wound up, us 6 individuals, who really ran this and did all the work involved. We had all the support of these other people, but it came down to 6 people. 6 people. We got the candidates to answer our questions online and have an online debate. They wouldn't do it on television, but those answers that we posted online created 850 million media impressions and all kinds of ancillary stories. The public was hugely interested. In fact, we did polling and found that 85% of the public, Democrats and Republicans alike, thought the candidates for president should be debating these things. So as a result of that, President Obama quoted part of our mission statement in his inaugural address, and he appointed several of our earliest supporters to key public policy positions. For the first time, a president went into office with an idea about how science fit into his overall public policy strategic agenda. There's John Holdren, who is the Presidential Science Advisor, Steve Chu, who is the Energy Secretary, Jane Lubchenco, who is the Director of NOAA, Harold Varmus, who heads the National Cancer Institute, Marshall McNutt, who is the Director of the USGS. All of them early science debate supporters who are actually actively trying to help us convince the candidates for president to do this. So it does make a difference. The people in this room are more than enough, far more than enough. People at one of these tables are enough to change the national dialogue. Okay, think about that. Any one of these tables contains enough people to change the national dialogue, like we did, and like we are continuing to work to do. Okay, in 2012, we did a similar thing. We still got turned down. They still won't do it on TV. But this time, it's already more than 1 billion media impressions. It's been widely commented on, particularly because Romney backtracked on what you saw in that video, and now he admits again that climate change is largely human caused, but he veers back into anti-science when he says there's no scientific consensus, which is simply not true. But it is having an impact. We are far more readily accepted by the national mainstream news media nowadays than we were in 2008. And here's a small sampling of many of the mainstream or more mainstream publications that have covered this or are continuing to cover this effort on an ongoing basis. So the re-injection of reason, of empiricism, of science into our national policy discussion. This is just the beginning. We don't have that much money. We're funded by small individual contributions. We're hoping to find a larger angel investor to fund efforts to expand this throughout Congress, because that's where the real action is. And then from there into the state legislatures, where so many anti-science types have been elected and are moving anti-science policies through, like Rebecca said. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we need to really realize that we are in a global civil war. We need to re-engage in the civic process, not just talking to each other, but talking to everyone else, and particularly people who don't feel like we do, and people who are on the fence. We need to work to reform the tenure system. Anybody that works in a university, please work on this. The tenure system right now has many parts in place that in many universities strongly discourage public outreach by scientists. We need to get them back into the public conversation, and we need to convince many scientists. A generation of them have been brought up believing that civic involvement is somehow dirty and damaging to their objectivity. That couldn't be further from the truth. As I've shown you, science is always political. It's never partisan. I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican. We just need knowledge in the discussion. We need to hold the media accountable. Everybody in this room can apply pressure and leverage to them. We remember all the talking about the liberal media, the liberal media, the liberal media. That was a constant talking point to put pressure on them. And they started to bend because they didn't want to be perceived as being biased. The same argument can go the other way. The anti-science media, the anti-science media, the anti-science media, the anti-reason media, the anti-empirical media, pick your term. Speak up for tolerance and reason anywhere you can. We need to work, run for your local school board. We need most local school boards, there's almost 15,000 of them throughout the United States. Most of them set their own curriculum, and they are populated by the local attorney, pastor's spouse, realtor, you name it. But very rarely is there a scientist or someone who thinks about reason on those boards that can speak up for that. And that's very important. That's one reason why we've slipped in international science rankings. Demand the American Science Pledge. This is something in the back of my book. You can find it on my website too. It's a request for candidates for office to pledge to base public policy decisions on reason and knowledge instead of their own personal beliefs. Finally, support sciencedebate.org and other similar organizations like it that are really working to move the public policy dialogue forward in this way. And then, of course, you can also buy Fool Me Twice and also spare for a friend. So, we live in a changed world. We need to evolve our thinking as well. And I'll leave you with this closing observation.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's a text probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, you can't get fooled again.
Thank you.
Mean trick, Samuel. Hello. Okay, any questions for Shawn?
I have an easy question. Are you looking for more speaking engagements in North and South Carolina?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm an evangelical right now, I have to say.
I love your message. Thank you.
Yeah. Find me on my website, ShawnOtto.com. All right, sign up. Okay, great. sciencedebate.org. Great.
So the first presentation this morning was about media, and we talked about what we call the buttons So belief, because, these different words that people use to sidetrack the debate. So what I see here, in your presentation is these are the facts. This is reason. This is what needs to be more a part of our dialogue. How do you suggest getting past those buttons and injecting this reason and talk into the dialogue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I suggest talking about it as a value issue. That reason is an American value. And it's fundamental to who we are as Americans, because we believe in the fairness of basing our public policy on what the evidence shows is best for everybody, and not just the beliefs of one select group. Yeah, but always, you're right, always come down to the value question, because emotion is what moves people. Facts, unfortunately, are the least convincing.
I was struck by your analysis of the impact of the creation of the NSF, National Science Foundation, and how it, like an unintended consequence, it allowed scientists to not engage publicly to get their views held. And it reminded me of a quote, I don't know who said it, but war is too important to leave to generals. It's almost like science is too important to just leave to scientists.
Absolutely.
That's not really a question, just an observation.
Yeah, no, it's terrific. And I should say that the younger generation of scientists get this much more, and the need to engage publicly. There's a lot of fantastic science bloggers out there, and I think that we're seeing a transformation, but we need to see it much more quickly because we're behind them all.
Excellent presentation, and I wanted to ask you questions about how we can influence the media about writing things. And so you suggested one excellent thing was to use that word, the anti-science media. And so I wanted to ask you, what else can people in this room do to promote this critical thinking, because that's a bigger national deficit than anything else?
Absolutely. Well, scientists are ranked higher in public esteem, the interesting thing about this, than anybody except firefighters and teachers. So it's incredible that the public respects scientists and science, but at the same time, certain political members have such anti-science views. And it could be that that's part of why the public is really disgusted with the whole process right now. Because this is really antithetical to what we've talked about and been taught about as Americans. So I would encourage people to go back to that civics lesson of what it means to be an American, and to remind the media that they need to report objectively on things. I would continually challenge them on the argument that there is no such thing as objectivity, and go back to all the science that has proven that wrong. Using objectivity, we've doubled our lifespans. We've multiplied the productivity of our farms by 35 times, all in the last century and a couple decades. And then shame them, really. The same way that anti-science types have done by calling them liberal media. Because they want to be perceived as being fair and impartial. And if you take them to task for being unfair and partial, and can make a cogent argument to that, I think that they'll move. There are some people that I've really written a lot about this. There are also people like Jay Rosen and Preston who have done a lot of work on this. National Public Radio, in response to that, I have to say, has changed their national standards, their reporter ethics and guidelines. They're no longer doing false balance, he said, she said. And you may have noticed that in their reportage. They're actually increasing their science coverage too, which is refreshing. At the same time, places like PBS, they did the recent NewsHour segment featuring Anthony Watts, a climate denier who's not a scientist, and did a false balance segment there again. And there was an online outrage that convinced the ombudsman to take a look at it and admit that they were wrong in doing that. So they will be responsive. It's just a matter of being vocal and being angry about it and getting them to pay attention. Thank you.
Great. Just wanted to encourage Maybe it's a little bit late in the conference for me to say this, but I feel like we're having a pattern of people of certain people asking questions. Maybe if someone who has not asked a question is encouraged. Oh, no, it's so much a question.
Well, I don't know, are you familiar with the documentary A Flock of Dodos?
Yes.
Have you seen that? I was just kind of sitting here thinking about this. I'm like, do you think that there might be some... One of the things that they hit on that was the fact that, like specifically like with evolution and creationism, that, creationism has these sexy, simple answers for everything. And that when it comes to scientists, we have very few, I guess you could say, outspoken celebrity scientists. I can think of like, if you have Bill Nye the Science Guy, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then like NPR does the Radio Lab, which I love. And I just wonder if maybe that's something else that we need to do too, is try to promote and or find scientists who are also great public speakers. And the TED Talks, I think, are starting to do that too. Those are starting to get some popularity. So.
Absolutely. Well, there are two things to say about that. One is we absolutely do need more great science communicators. And scientists' muscles in that regard have largely atrophied since 1957. And they haven't been taught it. They are starting to actually be taught it more. NSF even has funded a program to teach that to scientists. So we're making progress there. But the other thing is that I'm somewhat skeptical of the idea that we have to dumb it down. I think that we have to dumb it down for the far right, and that's why they have to dumb it down. But I think most of the American public is actually interested in complicated information. They're able to take in vastly complicated economic information. And it's in the context of our national public policy dialogue, which is why, for instance, science debate is so great. So I think that there's two sides to that answer. Yes, we absolutely need to improve our communication, the number of scientists and empiricists, if you will, that are out there speaking. But also, we don't need to dumb it down. I think we can give the public credit for their intelligence.
All right, can we do one more question? Oh no, some people raised their hands. I don't know that we've heard from you, or maybe not recently.
Going into the medical field / nursing field, as I am, what would be your advice? Because I consider myself kind of a scientist first. Any advice?
Boy, that's an open-ended one. I guess I would continue to, just in your interactions with other nurses and with physicians, to continue to use that position to encourage evidence-based thinking, evidence-based discussion. It's remarkable how many physicians' offices you go into that have on Fox News, for instance, and they're filling their minds with nonsense. And these are people who are ostensibly smart enough to really make a good contribution, and they're not. So challenging them to become a little bit more intellectually engaged, I think, would be a really good thing.
Don't eat pharmacy rat's lunch.
A little unsolicited advice from Dr. Hinton.